Welcome back. So our next topic of discussion will be Sarbanes-Oxley. I'm only going to talk about this briefly because we'll save our actual discussion for class. Okay. Sarbanes-Oxley basically holds management responsible for the accuracy of financial reports and also allocates additional responsibility to board audit committees. There needs to be a 5-member oversight board that has authority over practices of accounting firms, and it prescribes additional rules to improve auditing. This was in large part to scandals like Enron, where there are all sorts of bizarre accounting gimmicks designed to inflate shares, but also was violating the law. Okay. The CEO and the CFO actually have to sign and certify the accuracy of annually, quarterly financial statements, and this is done so that the CEO can't say, well, I didn't know people were cheating, I didn't know people were making stuff up with the accounting numbers. If they don't know and they sign, they're still liable for it. Okay, so it gives a greater degree of accountability on the CEO, and the CFO better well know. It also establishes heavy criminal penalties and establishes a degree of accountability at the very top of the organization. We'll talk about Enron and Lehman Brothers a little bit more during class. Of course, the Dodd-Frank Act. Let me put that up. You guys see me? Okay. Okay, the Dodd-Frank Act was designed to prevent a recurrence of the 2007-8 financial crisis. We'll talk a little bit more about that in class, though. So, board of directors, back to these guys. Board of directors are chosen after being nominated by the board and approved by a majority vote of the shareholders. Again, most shareholders like me, I don't even look at the ballots. I guess I'm kind of guilty. Directors are who work for the company full-time, or what you call inside directors. Those who are not employed by the company are called outside directors. Now, the inside directors are typically like the CEO, sometimes CFO and COO, but they're usually, it's either the CEO or some of these staff officers. Every once in a while, you'll see a line manager on there. But it's usually like an upper-level division. It's not like an individual retail outlet. It might be a director of an entire geographic region. So, yeah. Now, there's also outside directors, and of course, boards are kind of divided into committees, and each committee has a variety of roles. Of course, as I mentioned, directors are supposed to represent the interest of shareholders at all times, or owners. They have to exercise due diligence in supervising management, which means that the board of directors is supposed to know what all these people are doing, as well as the CEO. So it's a very, very broad oversight. The compensation for directors varies greatly by industry. Typically, what you do when you try to look at compensation for directors is looking at firms of a similar size and how much they're paying. Now, so what you wind up having is members of a board of directors saying, well, we're a similar size to this other firm that's usually a lot bigger, and so we need the same salaries as the directors of this other much larger firm. So director salaries just continually get inflated because the larger firms will say, well, this smaller firm pays as much as we do, now we need to get paid more. So it's a continual process of inflation. Yeah, it's a mess. Some other board functions. They approve the issuance of stocks and securities and the voting rights of different shareholders. They review and approve corporation goals and strategies. In theory, they're supposed to be the ones who select the CEO. They evaluate the CEO. They remove that CEO if necessary. And of course, they give general advice and counsel to management. We'll talk about the flaws in the system briefly. They create governance policies for the firm. They also dictate compensation policies. They evaluate each other and their performance. They nominate new directors and they exercise oversight of ethics and compliance programs. Now, again, as we mentioned, part of the role of the board of directors is to, actually give some degree of oversight of management. I can guarantee members of the board of directors don't go into a factory shop floor and start talking to people. It doesn't happen. Yes, it would be a good thing to do. It would be a nice thing to do. It would be a helpful thing to do. They don't do that. Okay? The CEO usually dominates the board. CEO is usually also the chairman of the board. So, yes, they're the ones who evaluate them, but then they also owe their positions to the CEO. So there's usually kind of a collegial feeling on different boards of directors. So it's certainly not a perfect system. An additional role that we don't talk about too much is also the board of directors is supposed to compose the company's strategy, and then they let the CEO actually execute the strategy. Now, about these people on the board, usually there's about 11 members on a board of directors. That seems to be the norm. Although the range can be 7 to 15. Directors are usually elected by shareholders. Terms of 1 year seem to be the norm. I mentioned that there's inside directors, outside directors, and there's also independent directors. Those are directors whose normal business functions don't really bring them into contact with that business. So if you pick your favorite S&P 500 company and look at who the board of directors are, they're usually like the who's who in business. Okay, so inside directors, well, as I mentioned, are people who work for that firm. They're usually senior executives. Outside directors, in many cases, are members of firms or executives from firms that are usually primary and sometimes secondary stakeholders. So the idea is you can kind of marry firms together and they all kind of start working together and they all kind of start thinking the same way. Independent directors, who are those? Well, those are people that don't have any dealings with the firm normally. And they are a mixed bunch. You will see celebrities on there. You see a lot of retired military, retired flag officers, so generals and admirals. You may see retired executive civil service. You see actors. You see all sorts of people who are independent directors. And of course, directors can also be very valuable, especially these independent directors, for, well, outside directors too, I suppose, for promoting the company image and possibly expanding their commercial activities. So, again, because these board members are usually have some sort of a full-time job somewhere else, being on a board is usually kind of a part-time thing for them. They usually get like a big thick folder before they have a board of directors meeting. Maybe they review it the night before. They meet, they meet about 8 times a year, sometimes monthly, but it's usually like a weekend activity. They all kind of get together. They discuss a few things. They have dinner. They have fun, and then they delegate everything off to the CEO and management and executive staff. There's usually committee reports, governance matters. Again, it's not a full-time job for many of these people, although they do get paid very well for it. Typically, the CEO is also the chairman of the board, and the chairman of the board presides over the meetings. So some of these meetings are sometimes just formalities. There has been a movement saying that CEO and chairman of the board role should be split. One problem with that, though, is if you have the chairman of the board giving instructions to management and the CEO is giving conflicting instructions to management, then who do you actually listen to? You basically have a snake with 2 heads and no unified direction. So it's seen to be dangerous for a firm. And of course, it greatly restricts the ability of the CEO to manage. Sometimes that's a good thing. So that wraps up this discussion about the board of directors and their dynamics. We'll talk more about this in class, don't worry. But now we're going to shift to executive compensation in our next video, but I will wrap it up here.